I'm fighting a cold, so I'm strategically positioning my throat lozenge here just in case I need it. Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the Jewish Home, and I hope that you take this opportunity to get a little better acquainted with our team and with our organization if you haven't already. I know Annette is more than happy to give you a tour, and we also have Annette Littman in the back of the room who fulfills a similar role at Jewish Home Assisted Living, so she'd be happy to talk to you. And in the corner is Susan Lilly, who is responsible for geriatric care management, Shelley Steiner behind her, Gallon Medical Adult Day Center, and Joan DePaula in the back of the room, who oversees all of our home and community-based services. So we're here to answer any of your questions and would be happy to tell you more about our organization and the things that we're doing moving forward. But today I'm here to talk about elder abuse. I have had the privilege of being involved in work on elder abuse prevention since 2012. I initially became involved with elder abuse when I became part of the Association for Jewish Aging Services, which is the national organization that represents Jewish retirement communities and senior housing across the United States and actually even into Canada and beyond. I became the CEO and president of Cedar Village Retirement Community, which is a similar organization to this, located in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 2007. And almost immediately after my joining the organization, a friend and colleague, Dan Reingold, who is the CEO of the Hebrew Home at Riverdale, which some of you may be familiar with, began to talk to me about elder abuse and elder abuse prevention and how we needed to get engaged in the shelter movement. And I listened to Dan for a lot of years saying, you know, you're the perfect place to do it, you're the perfect person to lead this, and I thought, we have so many things on our plate. But when we actually sat down and listened to Dan and his team, we realized that this is work that all of us need to do. And we had the same experience here at the Jewish Home family within the course of the last year. The first elder abuse shelter in the United States was actually opened at the Hebrew Home at Riverdale almost 11 years ago. It is the Weinberg Center for Elder Abuse Prevention. And the Weinberg Center really opened out of the efforts of Dan Reingold and a woman named Joy Solomon. Joy is an attorney who was working in the domestic violence space. And Joy happened to be sitting next to Dan at a meeting, and she was saying to him that one of the things that was so frustrating to her working in the DV space was that they didn't know what to do with older adult victims that were coming in. What do you do with the 85-year-old who is a victim of abuse and needs shelter? Because how many of you have been in a DV shelter? How many of you have ever toured one? No, you should. You should make a point of doing that. But it's what you imagine it to be. It is a place that oftentimes is more dormitory style. It's filled with young women and young children. Oftentimes the bathrooms are down the hall. There are lots of stairs. So we all work in elder care, right? So think about your 85-year-old who has difficulty with ambulation and a host of other medical problems, trying to function and trying to be cared for in a setting like that. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So as Dan and Joy spoke, they developed this idea that, you know what? We could house victims within the walls of existing services that are designed for older adults, within the walls of a nursing home, within the walls of assisted living. And that's the model that they began to create 11 years ago. Today, there are 16 shelters in the United States. We're number 16. We opened our shelter last summer. Now, 16 shelters may sound like a lot to you, but can anybody guess, not my team, please, can anybody guess how many victims there are estimated to be in the United States every year? Throw out a number.
100,000.
100,000. 200,000.
500,000.
500,000. Between 3.5 and 5 million victims every year. 3.5 to 5 million victims. And I just told you that there are 16 shelters. So it's a big issue. It's an under-recognized issue. It's an under-reported issue. It's an under-cared-for problem. Some of the reasons that elder abuse is an under-recognized issue is because of the population that we're talking about. And I'm preaching to the choir here. When we go out and we talk to community groups and we do training, we talk about the fact that older adults sometimes aren't listened to, right? Aren't acknowledged, are minimized. You all know this already. But the reality is, even when we were talking to some of our core teams, some of our community partners that work in the elder abuse space, we were talking about the fact that when an older adult goes into their physician or into the emergency room, and they often go, an abused older adult goes with whom? The abuser. So who answers the questions? And the older adult is often not given even the opportunity to have that private time with the physician to tell their story. They may begin to tell the story and the abuser says, oh, she's so clumsy, right? She's always bumping into things. She's always falling down. She's confused. She's this, she's that. And the reality is, unfortunately, that there are a lot of people that think once you hit the age of 80 or 85 that you automatically have some form of dementia. Now, a lot of people do, but there are some people who don't. And even people with dementia can still communicate what's happening to them and can still tell us what's going on with them. Elder abuse is all of our issue. It's an issue that's pervasive. It's an issue that is under cared for. One of the things that we know that's an interesting statistic as well is the fact that when we talk about the conversion rates, and when I talk about the conversion rate, and you all talk about conversion rates in marketing, similar thing, when I talk about the conversion rate from people making a call, doing outreach to a domestic violence shelter, take a guess what the conversion rate from someone making that hotline call to coming into a domestic violence shelter. Any guess?
5%.
5%? No, domestic violence actually, if someone's desperate enough to call that hotline, 70% conversion rate nationally.
Wow.
Remember that people are calling a DV hotline when they really think they're in fear of their lives or their children's lives, right? The elder abuse statistic, however, is very different. The conversion rate from someone being contacted or making a contact about shelter for an older adult nationally, under 10%. Under 10%. So why do you think that is? What do you think causes the low numbers for elder abuse being reported? Fear. Fear is a huge piece of this puzzle, right? What else? Embarrassment. The definition of elder abuse is abuse at the hands of a trusted caregiver, right? So who is that caregiver most of the time? It is a child, a grandchild, sometimes a spouse, but often, it is that person that you raised, that you taught values to, that you feel responsible for. So now this is the person that's abusing you, and it's embarrassing, right? It's embarrassing to have to admit that this person that you feel responsible for is committing acts and behaviors that you're so ashamed of. The other thing that gets in the way is the fact that to end abuse, you really have to sever that relationship with the abuser. Maybe at some point you can have that relationship again, but to end the relationship for a period of time, you have to create a space between the abuser and the victim. It's your child. Maybe it's your only child. Maybe it's your only family. There's a tremendous issue for people in being able to create that separation, right? Because it is such an incredibly painful thing to do. We've already mentioned that people don't get believed. We also know that access is really a difficult thing. The first thing that happens in abuse, whether it's domestic abuse, but even more so in elder abuse, is isolation. The victim is cut off from their general surroundings. They're cut off from their normal patterns. They're cut off from the people that they normally speak to. They're cut off from all kinds of things that might lead to that identification. So the problem becomes even more insidious. And that's another huge piece of it. They may not have access to have anybody ask them if they're okay, or to tell somebody that they're not okay. But we are all in a position to see it. We are all in a position to recognize it. When we first talked about elder abuse in my Cedar Village days, we did a conference call with the team from the Weinberg Center at the Hebrew Home. And we did about a 2.5-hour conference call. And when we got off the phone and everyone was energized about opening a shelter at Cedar Village, I remember saying, you know, this will be an opportunity for us to help people we haven't helped before. And before the words finished leaving my mouth, I knew that I already knew those people. I knew that we already had victims. We had the lucky ones that were already in our building. I knew that one of my favorite residents, Sylvia, who lived in our assisted living, I knew that Sylvia was a victim of elder abuse because she had lived in assisted living for several years and had turned the control of everything over to her daughter. And one day the daughter stopped paying the rent, and we couldn't get her by phone, and her mother couldn't get her by phone, and all the accounts were cleaned out. I knew that we had a man named Nelson who had been physically abused by his wife through his entire life. His daughter took over where the wife left off when the wife passed away, and when she had exhausted all of his resources, he had been a pharmacist, and he had had a fairly successful career. When the daughter had exhausted all of his resources, do you know what she did? She dropped him at the front door of the nursing home and pretty much, if I wasn't holding the microphone, washed her hands of him. Those are the lucky ones. Those are the people who end up in a setting where they're cared for. But there are lots of other people that we run into in our lives, professionally or personally, who are still in a situation that's not good. I want to tell you a few stories about some of the victims that I have had the opportunity to know. When I was working at Cedar Village, we opened the Shalom Center for Elder Abuse Prevention. Here we have a very similar program called Senior Haven for Elder Abuse Prevention. We have done a lot of education here, we've done a lot of outreach, we've had a number of referrals, but we have yet to admit our first victim. I hope that one of you will make the referral that will allow us to admit that victim. But I want to tell you about some of the victims with whom I did have the opportunity to get acquainted. And one of the ones that stands out in my mind is a woman named Ruth, who preferred that we call her Sammy. And Sammy lived in the city of Cincinnati all of her life. She raised her daughter as a single parent. She, as she would tell you, did the best that she could. But unfortunately, Sammy's daughter had a lot of issues. She had a very troubled childhood. She was involved with substance abuse and a life that was perhaps not what any of us would hope for our children. She left home and she came back a number of years later with a teenage daughter who had many of the same problems that her mother did. Sammy's family was abusing her physically. They had abused her financially. They were abusing her emotionally and verbally. She was in a very rough place. Identifying elder abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum. So the first point of contact that we had in recognizing Sammy's issue was from her physician, the first member of the team. And her physician called the house and said, Ruth's not making her appointments. What's going on with Ruth? She had an appointment, she didn't come. And the granddaughter answered in a way that the physician thought wasn't quite right. So the physician, whom we had trained, his office, I should say, called Adult Protective Services, another critical partner in this whole venture. APS went to the home, and what they found there was so disturbing to them that they wouldn't leave the house until they had made arrangements for Ruth, for Sammy, to come to shelter. The police, also a critical partner in the work on elder abuse, came to the home and physically removed Sammy from the home. She was so frightened of her daughter and granddaughter that we asked APS to grab photos of them so that we could bring them and post them at the front desk just in case anyone tried to see her. Of course, no one did, because by the time we brought Sammy to shelter, the damage had already been done. Sammy was the second victim that we admitted to the Shalom Center, and she ended up being the first one with whom we broke our own rules. One of the rules for shelter, and it's the same rule we have here, is that this is not about keeping people. Victims who come to shelter are afforded a 90 to 120-day stay, and we do that at no charge. If there is a payer source, if they qualify, if they have Medicaid, if they qualify for some Medicare days, we're happy to bill that. But if they don't, then we take them at no charge. Our medical director, Dr. Brose, has agreed to see any victim and care for them at no charge. The pharmacy provider that we use has also agreed to do the same thing. And in the event that we don't have space for a victim, our friends at the Hebrew Home at the Weinberg Center will take a victim from here, and we have an ambulance company who has agreed to transport a victim at no charge. So Sammy came into the nursing home, and she was a mess. She was terrified. She was so terrified that the staff, everyone knocks on a door and introduces themselves as they come into a room, but they had to really take their time with her because she was absolutely a terrified mess. And eventually she began to open up about her story and her life. The deal is that when a victim comes in, their identity is protected. Their story is only told to the people that need to know. The whole building doesn't need to know you have a victim in the building. The people that need to know are the folks that are caring for her, the staff that work on that particular unit. So Sammy became very, very comfortable with our art therapist and our music therapist. And she began for the first time in her life to express herself in a creative way. And I will never forget looking at one of the first pieces of art she produced, which was an amazing tree that she entitled New Life, New Beginnings. And she used to say to me on a regular basis, I can't believe I live somewhere that's so beautiful. Now, granted, it's a lovely building just as this is, but a nursing home is a nursing home. And for her to have that sense of real peace and safety was pretty amazing. She couldn't believe she had a television in her own room where she had the opportunity to control what she watched. I mean, we're talking about the simplest, most basic things in life. So Sammy not only had the opportunity to work with the art therapist, she worked with the music therapist. And one of the interesting things that we had was a bell choir, which was largely comprised of residents who had dementia. An amazing music therapist who would physically cue the bell choir. You would get exhausted watching her cueing these people as they would perform. And in the last concert that I had the opportunity to see there, lo and behold, there's Sammy wheeling herself up to the microphone, where she not only sang for the first time in her life in a solo way, but sang in front of a crowd using a microphone. And it was one of those moments where you thought, this is what this work is all about. She still wouldn't let us take a picture. She wouldn't let us take a video. She wouldn't let us share anything other than the view of her from the back of her head, because she lived in such terror that her daughter and granddaughter were going to find her. Now, the tragedy in all of this is that, this is not that she didn't miss this family. This is her family. This is all that she had. She had no other family. But the reality is that this was the only way to save her life. Some of the other stories have simpler endings. Not that they're good stories, we had a gentleman named Drew, who also was a story that I remember extraordinarily vividly. Drew was 67 years old when he came to shelter. Our shelter here, we take people 65 and over, so 67 was right within our realm. Drew's son had moved back in with him, and Drew had very severe Parkinson's disease. He also had a neurological condition that prevented him from holding his head up. His neck drooped all the time. And Drew's son moved back in with him because he wanted what pretty much every abuser wants, and that is money. Money. Elder abuse takes the form of every other kind of abuse. It's physical abuse, it's emotional abuse, it's verbal abuse, it's sexual abuse, but almost every case, there's an element of financial exploitation. It may start that way, it may end that way, but it exists in every single case. Neglect, of course, is also a form of abuse, and we see that frequently with our older adults. So Drew's son moved back in with him, and Drew's son was kind of a bad actor, and he would get very angry with his father, and he would shove him around, and he would grab him by the neck. And one day he got very angry with Drew, and he took him by the neck, and he threw him against the wall, and he left the house. And Drew was not ambulatory, I just told you that. But Drew really was afraid of not being able to survive this. So he crawled, using his arms, to his neighbor's house, and his neighbors called the police, and Drew came to shelter. He pressed charges against his son, and it turned out, which is what often happens, that there was another child living out of state who had no idea that this abuse was taking place. So Drew ended up moving closer to his daughter in Michigan after spending 120 days with us. Drew was so fearful that he would take the trash can and shove it in front of the door in his room because he was so afraid someone's going to come in and surprise him and hurt him. This is long-lasting damage, and our job really is to help people recover from that damage and to go on to live the rest of their lives with dignity and in safety. There are a number of models of shelter in this country. I'm just going to share with you what some of them look like. There is the model that we have here, which is really a single site model. So we bring in a victim, we care for them, we provide all of the services that they need, from rehabilitation, nursing care, medical care, nutritional support, pastoral care, social services. It's the full package. We also have some attorneys available to provide pro bono legal services if folks need that. Oftentimes they don't, because the damage is complete and there's really nothing to save, but sometimes they do. We work from the day of admission to plan discharge for the safest, least restrictive alternative. Again, this is not about keeping people. And those of you familiar with our organization know that we certainly don't even have room for people sometimes. This is about helping people to wind up in a place that is best for them. Many of the victims that we discharge will end up in assisted living settings. Some of them will end up living independently in the community. Some of them will be able to go back to their own homes when the abuser has been removed. So this is a single site model, same thing that exists at the Weinberg Center, at the Hebrew Home, and there's also another one that is very similar in Fairfield, Connecticut at the, they just changed their name, Jewish Senior Services in Fairfield. Some of the other models that are sort of interesting is one I call a hub and spoke model. And in Rochester, New York, and Buffalo, New York, they've created a hub and spoke model where there is a central referring point, generally the Agency on Aging, that has a designated person that takes all of the elder abuse referrals and phone calls. And then they have memorandums of understanding with 456 nursing homes or other facilities to place a victim. So when they get a call, the Agency on Aging does the triage, and then they will place a victim for as long as that facility will take them. In some places it's 2 weeks, in some places it's 30 days, in some places it is longer. There is a third model out there. It's a state-sponsored model, which is a pretty cool model. It only exists in Delaware. I think it only exists in Delaware because Delaware is such a tiny state that they can pull it off.